decision based on that. So they decided last week that, like, given that they've got to balance the budget by April 15th, and given that there's one more board meeting, it would be a bad idea to foreclose on, like, more discussion now. So they decided to put off that day of reckoning until April 4th. So March 14th still remains a pressure point because it's the next point at which, like I said, they're going to be in the public. There's a massive rally planned. Well, there's a rally planned. I assume it's going to be massive for 12:30 outside the transportation building, which is downtown. And the meeting starts at 1 p.m. The room holds about 70 seats. I've been in there. I know that, like, one group, Mass Senior Action, is going to bring at least 100 people. So if you guys don't show up, it'll be a standing room only crowd. And if different occupies show up and, like, my group shows up, then there'll be several hundred people trying to pack the room. Wow. And my only hope is that they don't move the meeting the day before the rally, because it's hard to adjust for that sort of thing. And then April 4th is the last board meeting before the April 15th balanced budget deadline. Again, it's a 1 p.m. meeting, but the rally is going to be at 3 p.m. and I believe it's going to be outside the State House, and I believe Occupy the Team is helping to coordinate that.
And also 5 p.m. continuing.
Right, yes, exactly.
Afterwards,
it's a long day of action. So, okay, I just added this for you guys, since you guys are doing action planning. I shouldn't say you guys, we are doing action planning. So these two folks who I met with, so the acting general manager, John Davis, I think he's also officially like the CFO of the MBTA, the chief financial officer. He's been the CFO for over 10 years, and, like, you could understand why he didn't appreciate me coming to him and having anything bad to say about the swaps, because they were his swaps. Like, he got the banks into these deals. He started by saying we. Like, the first few minutes of his conversation were all in the first person plural, and then he started saying I. Like, he just kind of owned it, not apologetically, by saying, like, look, I knew what I was getting into when I did these swaps. I have no compunction about it. I don't see why I should apologize for it. I'm not going to go to the banks to ask them to get me out of them. Like, I knew what I was doing. I understood the risks. And then the MassDOT CFO, Dana Levinson, he just joined in December 2011, and I really want to flag this for folks, and I've been trying to put it on other people's radar screens. And I know that actually Occupy the MBTA tweeted it a couple days ago. So a little bit about his background. He was the CFO of Chicago from 03 to 07. And his thing, like what he's best known for, is privatization. So he takes big public assets and he privatizes them. He privatized the Chicago Skyway, which is a toll road that runs from Chicago down to Indiana. Just sold it, sold it, but, like, leased it for 75 years. So essentially sold it to a bank. Privatized the city's parking garages. Tried to privatize Midway Airport. And I don't know if anybody has heard about the Chicago parking meters privatization fiasco. He was not involved with that, but he's on the record as saying, yeah, it seemed like a good idea at the time. So that's his big thing. And he sees cities, he's quoted as saying, he sees cities as, quote unquote, a portfolio of assets. So I just want to raise it for people, like, the MBTA is in dire financial crisis. In Massachusetts, like, privatization is not really caught on as an idea. I think people just, the government's not of that cast of mind. And yet, who do they bring in? But the former CFO of Chicago, who was, like, kind of the granddaddy of American asset privatization, and whose last job was with Royal Bank of Scotland, where he was the head of North American infrastructure and investment. And in that capacity, what he did was advise governments on how they can sell their assets and advise investors on how they can invest in those assets. So, like, that's his thing. That's his thing. And I don't know what his plans are for MassDOT, but I would just keep an eye on it. Then, of course, the target is the banks themselves. These three banks, so JP Morgan Chase is the only one that does retail banking in the US. In other words, like, that has a bank branch you can go into. None of these banks have such a spot in Boston, which makes action planning, like a challenge, I guess you could say. They all have offices, they all have lobbies, so the top one of each of those banks, one Post Office Square for UBS, one International for Deutsche, and 50 Rose Wharf, all happen to be along a 0.4-mile stretch running from the water to Post Office Square. So, if the weather was nice, like, one could march and hit all three banks. But just keep in mind that, like, they're stuck up on the 32nd floor. So another way to target these banks, obviously, aside from, like, shouting at their buildings, which isn't a great idea even if they're on the first floor, is like a Move Our Money campaign. So, and I can talk about a successful example of this a little bit later, but the city of Boston kind of came first to my mind. I know that you guys would be more interested in the city of Somerville. I tried looking into it and I couldn't find any connections. Like, there's usually some. Like, this is a big enough bank that they have some relationship. They get some fee for something, but I couldn't find it in recent years. So maybe there is. But the city of Boston does a lot of business with JP Morgan Chase. They do deposit banking, so they keep money like on deposit with JP Morgan Chase. JP Morgan Chase handles some of their bond business. Their last bond issue, they cut up into 4 what are called series, and JP Morgan Chase got a lot of fees off of that. And then my favorite thing is that in 2008, JP Morgan Chase, which is a bank with $1.8 trillion in assets, paid their CEO $20.8 million a year, got a property tax break from the city of Boston as a relocation incentive. And it wasn't like, some cities give relocation incentives so you'll go from like another city to our city, which I am no fan of, but like, whatever, at least I can understand what the logic is. This was not that. This was JP Morgan Chase moving from within Boston, Tremont Street in near Government Center, to the Seaport District, which was then developing. So they just stayed in the city. The city, I don't know if new jobs were created because of the incentive. I'm inclined to not think so, because $2 million to a bank with $1.8 trillion in assets is like literally pocket change, right? But they got that property tax break. It's like $140,000 a year. So you could say that JP Morgan Chase owes the city of Boston. I would say that JP Morgan Chase owes the city of Boston something. And the city of Cambridge used UBS for its latest bond offering. I think UBS got $250,000 in fees from that bond offering. So one question that I get when I bring up this wacky idea a lot is like, well, and in fact what the Dana Levinson from the T said was like, well, has this worked? Like, if you go to, like, let's say I was predisposed to go to the banks and ask them to get me out of these deals, like, they're going to say no. So where have they not said no? So one example, a prominent example, is the Asian Art Museum, which is in San Francisco, is a public-private partnership. It's, excuse me, run by a nonprofit foundation and the city of San Francisco jointly. And they were gonna go out of business, and they were gonna lay off lots and lots and lots of workers, many of whom were SEIU building services workers. So SEIU helped lead a campaign to kind of get JP Morgan Chase to help the museum get out of these swaps. They got the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, which is a part owner of the museum, to intervene, and they used street action and public campaign tactics, and it worked. JP Morgan Chase forgave some of the debt and canceled one of the swaps, and the museum was able to stay in business. And it's the largest collection of Asian art in the Western world. Another victory, this was the Move Our Money campaign that I mentioned. So the city of Los Angeles, which, as banking customers go, is a big banking customer, 10 times the size of the city of Boston about, had some interest rate swaps that were costing them $19 million a year. And this whole thing actually made the New York Times, like the Sunday Times above the fold. I want to say March 24th, 2010, but don't quote me on it. But if you Google Los Angeles interest rate swaps, like that's what you'll get. So the city council, a city councilor named Richard Alarson, put forward a motion that said the city should refuse to do business with a bank that doesn't let the city out of these swaps. And the city council unanimously agreed that is in fact what the city should do. And they also instructed their chief financial officer, or whatever, whoever their finance person is, to go to the banks and like have this conversation. So like, the thing that we tried to do with a meeting, which we suspected wouldn't work, but we tried. The thing that we can do with a meeting, the city council for America's second largest city was able to do through a resolution. So, there are ways to put pressure on these banks. So here's something, this has already been pretty technical anyway, so I'll just kind of pile on, but there's this thing called LIBOR, which a couple years ago, the British Bankers Association called the world's most important number. Does anybody know what LIBOR is?
London Interbank.
Good man. Does anybody know what the London Interbank offer rate actually is? So those variable rates that this is actually pretty important, but those variable rates that the bank is paying the T, that thing that is now on average like 0.2%, these are tied to interest rate indices. So like the market worldwide determines, or theoretically worldwide determines like what the interest rate is right now for debt. And right now it's determined that it's about 0.2%. Except not really, because the way this thing is, the way LIBOR, which is the index that most swaps are tied to, the way this thing is determined is that banks submit to the British Bankers Association every day an estimate, and it's just a bank submitting a ballpark of what it costs them to borrow from other banks. So like, in simple terms, what this means is a bank is telling publicly, here's how creditworthy we are. Here's how good our credit is.